Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Michelle, and around here we talk about 18th century women's history and what it's like to be a rookie novelist. A couple of years ago, I started learning how to play the flute. And pretty soon into that endeavor, I was introduced to a composer and performer, Anna di Venezia. She was born around 1738, died around 1769. And getting to know about her and her music made me wonder, what about women in the colonies during the 18th century? Were they playing the flute? And so I tried to find out, and I was really struggling to find any information about women in British North America who were playing the flute or composing for the flute. And I even enlisted the help of a really wonderful librarian at the Library of Congress, and we weren't coming up with anything. So let's talk about that. At first, the flute that was played in the colonies was the English flute, and this resembles more of a recorder, if you will. Eventually, the transverse flute, or the German flute, would become popular. It was first played in London on stage in 1706 and would make its way to Boston by 1740. And that was when there was a big explosion in folks wanting to learn how to play the flute. This was in part driven by an expansion of the middle class, because playing the flute and learning flute music was seen as an acceptable way for middle class men to explore their creativity and develop an artistic style. And they learned from traveling flute masters. These teachers would work their way through the colonies, teaching in private homes, teaching in taverns and inns and coffee shops, and that's where men would go to learn to play the flute. The flute became so popular that eventually it was second only to the violin in terms of its popularity. So while women in British North America might not have been playing the flute, women in Europe were. They often gained access to music in general, and the flute specifically, through their families. So being born into a musical family or marrying into a musical family. Now, this could work in reverse. You could be born into a musical family and then marry into one that was not, and that could end your flute dreams. Thinking of Anna di Venezia, who I mentioned at the beginning of the video, she learned music because her grandfather enrolled her in what was a music school, convent, and orphanage, all wrapped into one. But it was known for creating all-female ensembles playing music, and that's where she started her flute studies. Anna would eventually join the household of Frederick the Great. Frederick gifted two of his sisters flutes and encouraged them to learn how to play, and Anna served as one of their teachers. Wilhelmine von Bayreuth, who was one of Frederick's sisters, would compose for the flute and would perform with him for friends and family. And Anna Amalia, who was Princess of Prussia and also Frederick's sister, would also compose for flute. And in fact, her flute sonata in F major still survives today. But they would primarily only perform for themselves and for close friends and family. The novel that I'm working on is set in the 18th century, so I do like to immerse myself in 18th century culture, including reading books and newspaper articles and advertisements from the 18th century. With that in mind, I got on Playing the Flute, the classic of Baroque music instruction. This is by Johann Joachim Quantz, and he was a very prominent musician, music teacher, flutist, flute maker in the 18th century. And this is an essay about music performance and appreciation. And while the title does have the word flute in it, really only about 50 pages is dedicated to the flute specifically. But it was really interesting to read Quantz's words because he was one of the teachers that Anna Bonn di Venezia would have learned from. So that was just a really interesting connection to make. I'm actually going to include in the description box below a link to this book, and I'm also going to include a link to a performance of Anna Bonn di Venezia's Sonata No. 4, which is just lovely. So as always, thank you so much for getting nerdy with me, and I'll see you in the next video. I completely forgot to add that in the description box below, I'm also going to include an article that goes into a little bit more detail about women playing the flute in the 18th century, as well as a little bit of a creative piece that I put together. So I don't know why I forgot to say that before. So let's do this again. Thank you for getting nerdy with me, and I'll see you in the next video.